Wessex during the latter half of the 8th century was firmly under the influence of Offa, King of Mercia. Offa had defeated the previous king, Æthelwulf, in battle in 779, with Beorhtric either seizing the opportunity himself or coming to power with Offa's assistance 7 years later upon Æthelwulf's assassination. 786 saw Alfred's grandfather, Ecgberht, also make a bid for the throne of Wessex, but he was ultimately defeated and driven into exile in Francia by Beorhtric and Offa. Initially, Ecgberht escaped to Mercia, deducing correctly that Offa would gladly keep the rival claimant to Wessex's crown in his pocket as leverage over Beorhtric. However, in 789, the new king solidified an alliance with Mercia by marrying one of Offa's daughters. This prompted Ecgberht's flight to Charlemagne's court. Ecgberht, however, showed perhaps where his illustrious grandson, Alfred, derived his grit. Alfred's grandfather was actually a Kentish man born in the small kingdom between 771 and 775 as the son of the King of Kent, Ealhmund. Since Ealhmund was descendant of Cerdic, the semi-legendary founder of Wessex, both he and Ecgberht were of the royal house of Wessex. In 802, Ecgberht was presented with a second try at Wessex's throne. It was said that Beorhtric was accidentally poisoned by his own wife. Better still, the greater threat, Offa, was long dead too, opening up Ecgberht's path to the succession, with his candidacy probably backed by his powerful patron in exile, Emperor Charlemagne. Much like his grandson, Ecgberht's reign had a rocky start, with the Mercians under Cenwulf opposing him, with even a large raid taking place on the very day of his accession. Cenwulf likely resented the new king's intent of ruling independently, as under his predecessor Beorhtric, Offa and then Cenwulf had exercised significant influence over Wessex through Eadburh, daughter of Offa himself. However, with this marriage link gone and Ecgberht's close relationship with the powerful Charlemagne, Cenwulf likely sensed Mercian overlordship slipping away. The first 2 decades of Ecgberht's reign probably saw him consolidate his power within Wessex, staving off the pretensions of the Mercians to overlordship, as charters don't attribute Cenwulf as Lord of the South, which would indicate Ecgberht's subservience. During this time, Ecgberht's son and eventual successor, Æthelwulf, was also born to an unknown wife. Another indication of this independence came in around 815 with Ecgberht's expansion west, annexing the Bretonic kingdom of Dumnonia in what is now modern Cornwall, though it is likely that native resistance was strong, as he was recorded as campaigning in the region again 10 years later. In 821, Cenwulf died and was briefly succeeded by his brother Æthelwulf, who himself was deposed in 823 by Beornwulf. Beornwulf, fired by his desire to rekindle the glory days of Mercian dominance over the south, invaded Wessex in September of 825. The Battle of Ellendun was a decisive turning point in English history, Beornwulf's defeat smashing the Mercian hegemony forever. An immediate result of the battle was that King Ecgberht ordered his son Æthelwulf, along with a large part of his victorious host, to invade and occupy the lands of Surrey, Sussex, Kent and Essex. Æthelwulf was successful in driving out the Mercian puppet king of Kent, Baldred. Ecgberht rearranged these lands, placing them under the rule of his son Æthelwulf as a sub-king of Kent. Ecgberht further undermined Beornwulf's crumbling authority in 826, as just a year after Ellendun, the kingdom of East Anglia, who had previously been annexed under Offa, rebelled with Ecgberht's support, and Beornwulf was killed during the struggle. The next Mercian king, Ludeca, met a similar fate in 827, falling in battle. It was likely thought that Ludeca would receive support from the Kentish folk, giving the discontent of Wulfrid, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had had property confiscated by Ecgberht and his coinage discontinued, with the king even minting his own currency. However, perhaps sensing the tide of history, neither Wulfrid or Kent aided Mercia. Ecgberht's star continued to rise as in 829, building on the momentum of Ellendun and his recent conquests, he invaded Mercia itself and far beyond. His final push north drove Wiglaf into exile, with the king even reaching Dore in South Yorkshire. This stunning success quickly prompted the submission of King Eanred of Northumbria, the last major kingdom of the English, following extensive ravaging of the lands there. According to the later chronicler Roger of Wendover, Eanred paid Ecgberht tribute with little to no fighting. 829 also saw Ecgberht take control of Mercian London, and notably its mint. For a brief period, he even minted coins describing himself as King of Mercia, so that the Wessex-based Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of 829 recorded that he was the 8th king who was Bretwalda, a vague title which loosely means overlord. Since at this and earlier times the area known today as England was actually comprised of many major and minor kingdoms, any ruler sufficiently strong enough to compel either direct or indirect hegemony over most of them held such distinction. With his son installed as Under-King of Kent, Sussex, Surrey and Essex, Mercia subdued if not directly held, and Northumbrian subservience acknowledged, Ecgberht briefly surpassed even the exploits of the great Offa of Mercia. However, this supremacy so long dreamed of would not last. Just a year later, Wiglaf returned in Alfredian fashion to once again take up the fight, re-establishing his direct control over the region, though such a reversal may have only been partial given that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does record further submissions to Ecgberht in the same year, which suggests that Wiglaf's return may have ultimately been mutually agreed or at least tacitly tolerated, given such submissions would be strange otherwise, given traditional Mercian dominance over the Welsh. The Chronicle does describe Wiglaf recovering the Kingdom of Mercia, however, which may mean rebellion against West Saxon occupation. Other signs that Ecgberht's power was not so mighty as he may have assumed were charters issued in Wiglaf's name that indicate authority within Middlesex and Berkshire, with an 836 example describing bishops from the territory claimed by Wessex as our, though this could merely be an empty claim on Wiglaf's part. What is not in dispute is that the Kingdom of East Anglia, at around this time under King Aethelstan, minted coins in his name, brazen demonstration of independence from both Ecgberht and Wiglaf, with the East Anglian monarch probably being the man behind the defeats and deaths of the previous two Mercian kings, Beornwulf and Ludeca. As for explanations as to how and why Ecgberht's rise and fall happened, firstly, his swift conquest of the southern kingdoms under Mercian dominance following Ellendun were as much down to Mercian weakness as his own strength. Beornwulf had violently dispatched his predecessor in 823, with Ciarnwulf's reign being particularly noted as turbulent. This internal discord was not uniquely Mercian either. East Anglia had been directly ruled by Mercian kings, but clearly had men with their own ambitions, as King Aethelstan's rise in the 830s indicates. Northumbria's quick submission too likely owed as much to its internal strife as to the might of Ecgberht's arms. With King Ethelred's murder in 796, no less than 5 kings ruled before Eanred's long reign, which began in 810. Such infighting thus only weakens a kingdom. Another factor is the possible dependency of Ecgberht on the Kingdom of Francia for support. After all, Ecgberht had spent his years of exile in Charlemagne's court, and may even have received both the Emperor's and the Pope's support for his bid for Wessex's crown to begin with. Indeed, evidence of a continuing relationship also exists in Ecgberht's later request for safe passage for pilgrimage to Rome in 839 from Emperor Louis. In 814, Charlemagne's son Louis became emperor, but could not hope to fill his great father's boots. As a devout man willing to publicly show his piety by doing public penance, he proved wildly popular with chroniclers of the time, who named him Louis the Pious. He attempted to placate the ambitions of his own sons by dividing the empire. However, this hope was dashed as he was briefly deposed in 830, only to be restored by 2 of his sons for fear of the third. In 833 this repeated once more, with Louis still unable to square the circle of succession by his death in 840. With these grave matters occupying the Franks, it was probably little wonder that support became scarce during Ecgberht's key years, heading into the late 820s and early 830s. However, despite the loss of overwhelming dominance, Ecgberht had achieved a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of England. Mercia could no longer claim suzerainty over the southeast, nor East Anglia, who would remain independent for a time. Mercia may have retained some control or influence over Essex, however, Kent and Sussex were firmly held within the West Saxon orbit. Yet if Ecgberht lamented his loss of overlord status, then events would not permit him to mourn for long. Disturbing reports of a new menace from beyond the sea had been a common feature of life for some time. Way back in 789, during the reign of Beorhtric, 3 ships were sighted and made landfall in Portland on the Dorset coast. As with such events, word was sent to a certain Ecgberht, a royal official of the king, who confronted the men. Ecgberht probably assumed they were Frankish or Frisian traders and ordered them to accompany him to nearby Dorchester, probably to extract some form of duty. Yet if the royal official expected quick obedience to his demand, then he was horrifically mistaken, as in place of meek compliance, the band of men, pulling their ships up the shingle beach, simply turned on him, cutting both him and his royal party to pieces. Just 4 years later, in 793, the far more famous sack of Lindisfarne occurred in the Kingdom of Northumbria, these events signalling the beginning of the Viking Age. Not only England, but even the mighty Carolingian Empire suffered raids, though Charlemagne considered these more an annoyance than anything else. In 836 though, they became a deadly threat to King Ecgberht, as a force of up to 35 ships made landfall at Carhampton in Somerset. Such a brazen display by pirates in the heart of Wessex could not go unmet by the supposed Bretwalda, with the king assembling his own army. Ecgberht's army was in turn led by 2 bishops and 2 aldermen, with levies being drawn from at least 2 local shires, with these anonymous men falling, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in great slaughter. While the exact magnitude of the defeat can be debated, given the pro-Alfredian Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was first compiled in King Alfred's reign and thus promoted his own and his house's achievements while downplaying the defeats, what is known is that the Viking host remained in the region for around 2 years, and that they were supported by Ecgberht's old enemy, the Dumnonians. If these West Welsh men had risen to aid the Vikings, then news must have quickly spread of the great Ecgberht's defeat at Carhampton, damaging his reputation enough for these Britons to try their luck with the invaders. How severe the invasion was can only be guessed at, with estimates from 30 to 60 fighting men per ship. This means that the 35, possibly as low as 25 ships, varied a Viking force of a few hundred to a couple of thousand men. That this army inflicted a defeat on the man claiming to be Bretwalda was not insignificant. The men of Dumnonia clearly thought little of this claim, and felt the time had come to reassert their independence from Wessex. As for Ecgberht, he had learned hard lessons both about the new enemy that plagued these lands, and the fragility of lordship, since his expeditions in 815 and 825 had clearly not cowed the British Celts enough to prevent them joining the invaders. Ecgberht was down, but certainly not beaten. He was in his late 60s, for the time a very old man, around a year after Carhampton, but evidently still had one good fight left in him, as he once more mustered his levies and entered modern-day Cornwall to meet his enemies in open battle. The subsequent Battle of Hingston Down, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle crows, both Cornish and Danes were put to flight. Hingston Down was Ecgberht's last hurrah and one of his lasting gifts to his successors, given it effectively ended the independence of the Dumnonian kingdom, which had been disputed for around a century. The last king of the region, Dungarth, was recorded as dying in 875, though even this shadowy figure was likely a mere sub-king under the crown of Wessex. Much later, King Æthelstan, Ecgberht's great-great-grandson, set the permanent boundary of this modern county of the Tamar. In 838, Ecgberht was around 68 years old, ancient by the standards of the age, and with the succession in mind, he gathered a council at Kingston upon Thames. The king was luckily acutely aware of how succession disputes in the kingdoms he had subdued allowed his very success in the first place, and was also more than aware of his old benefactor Louis the Pious's fate. He wished to avoid Wessex falling to anarchy and war after his own death. The trouble was that Anglo-Saxon law was not decisive on who should succeed a reigning monarch. In this time, the eldest son of the reigning monarch was not assumed to be the king's successor. Indeed, no son had peacefully succeeded in this way for around 2 centuries. Any man with sufficient descent from Cerdic could claim Æthelwulf or king-worthy status, and thus stake a claim which is not a recipe for peaceful succession. The ultimate decision of who succeeds was actually in the hands of a council of important men, who consisted of the king's relatives, the aldermen, who actually ran the civil and military administration of the counties, the clergymen, that is the archbishop, the bishops, abbots, etc., as well as the landed aristocracy or thanes, collectively known as the Witenagemot or Witan. This informal body was consulted on many great issues of state, and crucially also elected the king's successor. For Ecgberht in 838, he had 2 methods of attempting to influence the Witan to accept his son Æthelwulf as king: force or bribery. The former tactic had been employed by the last Bretwalda, Offa, who managed to gain acceptance for his son Ecgberht to succeed him, though it obviously backfired, given that his son died in the same year as his father, and Mercia then plunged into dynastic strife. Ecgberht thus tried the second method, bribery. He granted lands in a charter to the sees of Canterbury and Winchester, which would be confirmed in a later charter by Æthelwulf himself. These grants to these senior clergymen were contingent on their support for Æthelwulf, as bluntly stated, "We ourselves and our heirs shall always hereafter have firm and unshakable friendships with Archbishop Æthelwulf and his congregation." Having effectively ruled Kent and the eastern satellites of Wessex since 825 anyway, as sub-king, Æthelwulf had served a long apprenticeship preparation for the kingship, and in 840 the Witan apparently agreed, as Æthelwulf, son of Ecgberht, succeeded his father as King of Wessex without incident. Ecgberht himself had finally died in 839, and did much to smooth Æthelwulf's path to the crown, not just the aforementioned land grants, but also willing, according to his grandson Alfred's own later will, that his lands only be bequeathed to male members of his house, thus retaining royal control of the wealth he had gained through his conquests. During the king's long reign, the city of Winchester had increasingly urbanized, with Ecgberht being buried there, as were his son Æthelwulf, grandson Alfred the Great, and his great-grandson Edward the Elder, which indicates a high regard for the city from the later West Saxon monarchs. The significance of King Ecgberht's reign cannot be overstated. His conquests over the southeast and brief overlordship of what would become England asserted Wessex as the most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms before the eventual invasion of the Great Heathen Army in 865, which allowed for stiffer resistance than might otherwise have been encountered, and leading the way to the eventual successes of his descendants, including Alfred, his grandson, and Edward, his great-grandson, in driving out the Viking invaders. Although Ecgberht had ultimately failed to permanently unify all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under his lordship, he had achieved a smooth succession for his son Æthelwulf, the father of King Alfred the Great, a feat not to be scoffed at considering that up to that time the throne of Wessex had often been fought over by various branches of the line of Cerdic. Ecgberht was thus a great king of Wessex, an adventurer, soldier, and conqueror, the progenitor of the monarchy of England. Thanks for listening to this epic video on one of the great pre-conquest kings of England. As you can imagine, these videos take a lot of time and effort to make, so if you love this content and the wider channel, drop a like, support the channel by sharing and subscribing, and I shall see you next time.